Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to Travel Talks. My name is Kate Sanders, the Director of Alumni Group Travel and Academic Enrichment at the OSU Alumni Association. The online Travel Talks program invites experts from across the university to join us for a webinar to learn about the places we travel. All of our talks are recorded and they are saved online for on-demand viewing. We will upload this talk in just a few days as well. Save the date for March 11th for our next travel talk on marine life on the Oregon coast with the Big Fish Lab. The registration link is posted at 4oregonstate.org/travel talks. Before we begin our program, I want to highlight just a few upcoming tours. Our 2025 trips are filling, and we're starting to see bookings into the fall and winter and even into 2026. So have a look if there's something that might be of interest. The first one is Ireland. If you want to disappear for a while this June, check out Coastal Gems of Emerald Isle, including Northern Ireland. It's a great mix of touring and free time. And then we also have India. India was our last travel talk. So if you didn't have a chance to see that last one, it is recorded and you can check it out. It's an amazing opportunity to travel with Dr. Sunil Khanna. He's an OSU professor and Sarah and Robert Rothschild Endowed Chair in Global Health. Not only will you experience India, his home country, with Sunil, but he was also helped us put this itinerary together. You'll meet the people of India, talk about the culture, see the wildlife, experience Diwali, which is the Festival of Lights, and not to mention key sites such as the famous Taj Mahal. And I wanted to let you know that I just added this trip for 2025 because it sounded amazing. This is Montreal and Quebec City at Christmas time. We just got ended a busy holiday season, and you may have been thinking to yourself, gosh, I wish I was traveling in December. We'll start planning for it now. And then head to Montreal and Quebec City in early December, and you can stay at the Chateau Frontenac, which this is a picture of the Chateau Frontenac, and it's an amazing property. And then you'll have a chance to visit Old Quebec Christmas Market. And this close tour, I will say, will give you a feeling of being far away. And there are definitely there's a train ride from Montreal to Quebec, and I know that we have a lot of train lovers out there. So check this one out. The other new one I wanted to be sure to highlight is Antarctica Direct. If you wanted to go to Antarctica, but passing the Drake Passage was something that is keeping you back, well, now you can fly there. So you can actually fly to Antarctica on this tour and then board your ship and then do the rest of the tour and then fly back home, missing the Drake Passage. So it's something to think about if Antarctica was on your bucket list. Okay, enough about all these other trips. Let's talk about going on vacation in medieval times. For tonight's talk, our medieval expert is Associate Professor Tekla Budi from the School of Writing, Literature, and Film. Tekla received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 2013, just before receiving the Kathleen Hughes Junior Research Fellowship at the Newnham College in Cambridge. Tekla specializes in late medieval literature, and her research focuses on ways medieval writers were influenced by and influenced the study of music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. Her first book, Sonic Bodies, investigates forms of silent or metaphysical music in English literature from 1300 to 1550, and it won the Anne Middleton Book Prize in 2023. Her second book, which is in progress, is on the mathematical imagination of the late medieval literature. And today, she is going to answer the question, did medieval people go on vacation? Let's find out. Tekla, welcome to Travel Talks.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and I'm happy to see so many people here in the audience who also are excited to hear about this topic. I'll let you know right now that the topic of medieval travel is a really big one. And today I'll only be talking about a very small part of it. The medieval globe was vast, and there are a lot of cultures in the medieval period that I won't even really begin to start talking about today. So, what I will talk about is my area of expertise, which is medieval Europe and England more specifically. So I look forward to hearing from you all in the Q&A, and hopefully I can maybe touch on those other areas of the globe in a little bit of detail in the Q&A if you have questions about them. All right, so let me start sharing my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation ready and queued up for everybody here. Again, yeah, so we'll just get started. All right, so traveling through time, medieval vacations. I've included my email address here on the bottom of this first slide. You can reach me at, my last name is Bude, B-U-D-E, my first initial is T, Budet at oregonstate.edu, or feel free to email me at the other email address that goes to the same inbox. It's tekla.booty@oregonstate.edu. I also see that there's something in the, okay. Yeah, thanks, Kate, for putting that in the chat. Let me close that. All right, okay. All right, let me get started. So it's 1413. In England, the first Lancastrian king, Henry IV, dies, and his young son, Henry V, who will go on to become one of England's most famous military heroes, accedes to the throne. The Hundred Years' War, which has been going off and on between England and France since 1337, is in a tentative period of peace. But this doesn't mean that Europe is free from war or conflict. In England, the Welsh uprisings of Owen Glendower challenge English supremacy on the island of Great Britain. In France, the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War has led to slaughters throughout the country and the notorious first storming of the Bastille. In the North Sea, privateers and brigands associated with the international mercantile group known as the Hanseatic League extort protection money from sailors traveling and trading between the polities of Northern Europe. And further south in the Mediterranean Sea, Ottoman-Venetian tensions are rising as the two great naval empires, one Christian, one Islamic, clash over wealthy trading entrepot in the Balkans and Anatolia and the Middle East. To add to this all, the papal schism is still ongoing. Recently, there were actually 3 popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, and one in Pisa. And since the devastation of the Black Death in the 1430s, there has not been a single year on record in which there hasn't been an outbreak of plague somewhere in Europe. So it was the best of times. It was definitely also the worst of times. Ooh. It's 1413. An upper middle class woman from the wealthy Norfolk shipping town of Bishop's Lynn, now known as King's Lynn, has had a spiritual awakening. For years, Marjorie Kemp has been having visions of God. He comes to her in her dreams and calls her his special child. She hears music in her ears that seems to come from heaven. God tells her to give up eating meat and to give up having sex with her husband, with whom she has already had 14 children. Marjorie screams and cries in ecstasy when she hears God speaking to her, which is basically every day, and sometimes multiple times a day. And so for years, she has not only been Bishop Lynn's mystic, but also its madwoman. Part laughingstock, part respected conduit of divinity, her friends and family and priests don't quite know what to do with her. She's a little strange. So in 1413, when she asks her husband for leave to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and Rome without him, by the way, it's 1413, and women can't go on pilgrimages without their husband's permission, he agrees on one condition. Marjorie, who has inherited and has control of her own fortune through her father, who was once the town's mayor and who is much better off than her husband financially, needs to pay off her husband's debts before she leaves. So she does. We don't know how much those debts were, but they were probably quite a bit. And she leaves Bishop's Lynn in 1413 and goes to Jerusalem and then to Rome on her way home from Jerusalem. The trip overall will take her 2 years. What I've included on the screen right now is an itinerary, the itinerary that Marjorie Kemp took on this first pilgrimage of hers, as well as an image from a 1450 manuscript showing a picture or an illustration of the Holy Land. And I just want to note that while the image that I'm showing on the screen is in some ways fantastical, it actually has some relationship to reality. So you can see at the bottom of this, at the bottom of the image, the sort of ruins of a city or a fortress. And this is probably the city or fortress of Athlit, a Templar pilgrim castle that was abandoned in 1291. Just above that, in the lower center, the city with all of the small red and blue turrets is the city of Ramla. In the center left, you can see Bethlehem with its basilica, the historical birthplace of Jesus. In the center top, we see Jerusalem, which here is viewed from the west. And in the middle, that thing with the sort of like onion-like dome is the Dome of the Rock. You can see also Al-Aqsa Mosque to the right of that, which is shown as a church and has a golden dome on top. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre you can see as well, and that's the sort of open-topped dome on the left back part of the city. And then in the top left of the image, up a winding pathway, is the Mount of Olives. All right, okay, so anyway, Marjorie spends 2 years on this first really grand pilgrimage, and she returns back home in 1415. But this pilgrimage won't be her last. Only 2 years later, in 1417, she goes on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in what is now Portugal. And then again, in the last years of her life, she will go on a shorter pilgrimage through Northern Europe with her daughter-in-law. By this time, all of her own children, all 14 of them, have died, and her daughter-in-law is her only surviving family. Now, we know about Marjorie's travels from the sole surviving copy of her life story, which she dictated near the end of her life in the 1430s or 1440s, and which survives in one manuscript that is now owned by the British Library. I've included the first page of the manuscript here on the left-hand side of this slide. If you ever go to London, I really encourage you to go to the British Library and stop in at the Medieval Manuscripts exhibit. Sometimes her book is displayed, and you can see it for yourself. Because I'm a medievalist and I get to touch and handle and deal with manuscripts whenever I go to the British Library, I've been able to look at this manuscript myself and to page through it, and it's really just a lovely little, very plain but lovely little manuscript. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, I've included some modern editions of the Book of Marjorie Kemp. On the top is a version that you can find online. It's through the Middle English Text Series. And after this talk, if you've become curious about Marjorie Kemp and medieval pilgrimage, you can Google this page and read it yourself, although the text is in Middle English, so it's a little bit hard to read without training. But if what you'd like is a modern translation, I highly recommend the Lynn Staley translation and edition of the Book of Marjorie Kemp, which I've included an image of below. So this is a true story. Marjorie Kemp was a real person, and she really experienced the things that she claims to have experienced in her book. I mean, you don't need to believe that she experienced divinity, but she had some sort of psychological experience that provoked her to go on pilgrimage. On the one hand, Marjorie's life was thoroughly extraordinary. Her book is the first autobiography in English, and it recounts hundreds of mystical visions over the course of around 40 years, eventually culminating in a vivid description of her marriage to God, which is described in overtly sexual terms. I tell you, it's a great book for reading, if a little strange. In the course of her travels, Marjorie had audiences with some of the most powerful people in England, the Archbishop of Canterbury probably being the most famous of those, as well as another famous English mystic and important medieval woman writer named Julian of Norwich, who, if you dabble in mysticism or in women's writing or in spirituality, you might have heard of, as well as countless priests and confessors. When she arrives in the Holy Land, her description of her travels is one of deep sort of feelings about time and the experience of it. For Marjorie, she isn't just visiting the places where, as a medieval Christian, she believes Jesus was born, died, and resurrected. She's actually reliving and re-experiencing the life of Christ herself. When she sees a holy woman in the street holding a baby, that holy woman becomes the Virgin Mary holding the baby Jesus. Later, Marjorie actually feels the physical pain of the crucifixion when she visits Golgotha, the site of the supposed site of the crucifixion, and so forth. So for Marjorie, the many pilgrimage trips she took in her life were immersive and totally integrative, not just closing the temporal gap between the past and the present, or the spatial gap between her home in Bishop's Lynn and Rome, Jerusalem, or Santiago, but actually melding them together. We, and by we, I mean me and other medievalists and students of people like me, still read Marjorie's book today for the really personal, rambunctious, and often disturbing picture it gives into the psychology of medieval religious experience. Her life story is interesting because it's so different from the sorts of lives most of us lead today, and indeed probably from the sorts of ways that we travel. I don't think that I've ever had a mystical experience on any trip that I've taken. I mean, I've had some really thoroughly enjoyable ones where I really felt gratitude or joy to be in a particular place, but I don't think I've ever stood somewhere and felt as if I was actually experiencing some version of heaven, you know? Um, but on the other hand, the travel stories in Marjorie's book and the what I would call like her vacations that she goes on are also startlingly normal, showing us how even the strangeness of medieval religious experience can also hide the very relatable psychology of the dangers, silly stories, and petty dramas of interpersonal relationships. And that's because her book details not just the spiritual highs of travel, but also its earthly lows. For instance, throughout her book, when Marjorie's talking about going on her pilgrimages, she's always in a group of people. Solo travel in the medieval period would have been incredibly dangerous and was never done. Anybody who traveled was traveling with people who accompanied them, whether those were servants or whether those were people that they had hired along the way to show them the way from one place to the next. And in pilgrimages in particular, you'd also often be going in a group of people who were on pilgrimage. Marjorie, because she's constantly screaming and wailing, is a horrible traveling companion. She sits down at dinner and she's weeping the whole time. Nobody wants to have a big communal, like Thanksgiving style dinner with somebody who's sitting at the table screaming. She also has a strange vegetarian diet that her fellow travelers don't understand. And the other pilgrims who are on her pilgrimages with her are there in part to have a really good time. Marjorie, on the other hand, is taking everything seriously, very seriously. So in her book, we get this sense that everybody just kind of thought she was a really bad time to hang out with. For those of us who've been on trips, who've had to fly in overpacked airplanes, or who've been standing behind people who don't know how to queue properly, or what have you, we've all experienced people who like don't seem to be traveling in a way that is good for us. And we get really frustrated with those people. And we can see that in Marjorie's book. We also see in her book tales about seasickness and the dangers of ocean travel. There's a moment in Marjorie's book where Marjorie and all of her traveling companions are about to hire a ship to take them across the Mediterranean. They're at the port of Venice, and everybody's really concerned. A lot of times, these pilgrimage groups would wait in Venice for 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 14 weeks to find a reliable guide across the Mediterranean. And Mediterranean sea travel was relatively dangerous. But Marjorie has a vision from God that tells her that she and everybody who's on a boat with her will have a safe sea crossing. And then they all get on the boat and voila, they all have a safe sea crossing. Obviously, like you don't need to believe that God actually spoke to Marjorie in that instance to recognize that what the book is talking about is that travel is always precarious, and danger, especially on the sea, is really always present. Okay. At another point, her fellow travelers, sick of her antics, actually take her clothing and they cut it so that her dress, which up until that point had been like a very modest medieval woman's style dress, a long shift going to her ankles, is now like basically like a mini skirt. And she's absolutely humiliated, having to wander around on pilgrimage in this outfit that is absolutely would have marked her as if not mentally unwell, absolutely available for instance, to be assaulted. And in fact, that actually happens to her. At one point, she's robbed. And at another point, she loses a ring that is really special to her. It's inscribed with the words in Latin, "Jesus is my lover." It's a wedding ring, essentially, that was given to her by God. Okay. Another time she's riding into Jerusalem on a horse, and at her first sight of Jerusalem, she's so shocked by what she sees that she actually sort of falls off her horse onto the ground and is hurt. Her travel stories are also full of chance encounters. She happens to run into a fellow English person in Rome who's able to translate for her. Who among us haven't had an experience of traveling in a country where we don't know the language and feeling utterly adrift in an alien space? And maybe we've been lucky enough to run across somebody who's bilingual or multilingual who can help us, I don't know, find our way back to our hotel or our hostel. So again, while Marjorie's travels are in many ways very foreign to us, there are these moments where, even through the historical distance, similar issues of psychology and the dangers and also excitements of travel pop through. But what I'd like to say also here is that what the Book of Marjorie Kemp also speaks to is the how large and important the medieval travel industry was. So the title of this talk was basically a question: did medieval people go on vacation? And I'm here to say that yes, absolutely. I think that they did. Their vacations looked different from ours, but they absolutely did take time away from their daily work in order to spend some time ruminating on maybe the bigger things of life, seeing the world, and trying to understand their place in the world by going somewhere new. And so, to that extent, pilgrimage is actually, I would argue, the quintessential type of medieval vacation. Um, Medieval vacationers in the form of vacations in the form of pilgrimages are perhaps in a way like serious in a way that our vacations don't necessarily always have to be, in that they were intentionally meant to be spiritual. And so as you're going on these pilgrimages, you're working on saving your soul. But at the same time, medieval pilgrimage was full of joking and ribaldry and alcohol and sex and danger, in the same way that some of our best vacations in the modern world are. So let me just go over a little bit about the different types of medieval pilgrimage that a person in Western Europe could go on in the 14th century. And here I'll get away from Marjorie Kemp, although I'd like us to keep her in the back of our minds as we're going through these examples. And I welcome questions on any one of these examples of medieval pilgrimage. Okay, so first of all, what I have here on the screen is a page from a book that was published not in the medieval period, but in the Renaissance / the early modern period by Braun and Hogenberg. This is the Civitates Orbis Terrarum, or the cities of the globe of the world. And here we have an overhead sort of aerial view of the city of Venice. This is a wonderful book, by the way. You can get a reproduction copy through Taschen Press, and it's massive. It's like a foot by a foot and a half by about 4 inches thick. And it includes all of these beautiful color illustrations of different cities around the world in the medieval and early modern period. I own a copy. I'd hold it up for you now, but you have this slide to look at. Anyway, Venice I'm using here as a really good example of medieval travel because Venice was one of the most important sites of travel as far as pilgrimage goes in the medieval world. While Rome might have been more important spiritually, it was Venice that served, because of its sort of eastward facing positionality in the Mediterranean Sea. It served as, and because of its history of sort of maritime excellence, it served as the place from which Europeans would jump off when they were going on a pilgrimage, for instance, to the Holy Land or to other places around the Mediterranean. And what we know is that, for instance, Marjorie Kemp and her companions spent 10 weeks in Venice, kind of hanging out, waiting to get a ship to Jerusalem. We also know that Venice had plenty of spaces and plenty of like networks and accoutrements set up for its massive pilgrimage industry. And to give you a sense of what massive means here, I'm talking like thousands of people would enter and exit Venice every day. And this is a lot of people in a world where, for instance, the city of London boasts a population of about 50,000, right? So even the biggest cities in medieval Europe are relatively small. And when you're a major destination port city, you are seeing your population increase by 10, 15, 20% due to the number of people who are flowing in and out of it every day. So what this meant is that Venice needed places for people to stay. And many of these places are places that we sort of still use as hotels when we go on European vacations in the 21st century. So these include places like ospitale, which is where, it's related to the English word hospitals. And these absolutely were hospitals. So they took in the sick and the poor, but they also took in travelers. And here in the image on the left, this is not an image of an ospitale in Vienna, or sorry, excuse me, Venice, but it is one in Siena. And you can see that there are some sick people here, but there are also some very sort of like well-dressed doctoral looking folks in the background. So we have travelers as well as the sick spending time in these hospitales. There are also what we would think of as more like hostels, which again is a word that is related to the word hospital. Hotel is related to the word hospital. And these are ospizi, and these are specifically for pilgrims. These are pilgrims' hospices. There was a famous one in Venice known as the Ospizio Chelsea, which I think no longer exists and is now a different building. But there are also, and I've included an inn on the right-hand side of this slide, there are also inns and taverns where people might have spent the night. Most inns had room for about 20 to 40 guests. And the entire city was full of bars and taverns and places to get either illicit or an illicit drink. We also have records from the medieval period of big cities trying very hard to legislate their sex work industry around tourism, specifically pilgrimages, to the extent that there are actually in Prague, there are rules drawn up around specific church festivals that actually allow church-sanctioned sort of sex shacks in the cathedral vicinity, where sex workers can do their work for all of the people who are visiting the town. So while medieval pilgrimage was a serious event, it was also full of the same sort of vices that everybody around the world has always practiced. Now, why would one go on pilgrimage? You go on pilgrimage because going on pilgrimage confers certain spiritual benefits to you. Let me just make sure I haven't missed something yet. Confers certain spiritual benefits to you. The medieval dogma and theology taught that after death, believers, unless they were very holy and very lucky, wouldn't go directly to heaven, but would spend hundreds of thousands of years in a sort of holding tank of spiritual labor called purgatory. And going on pilgrimage would get you, depending on where you went, what year, to what shrine you went, and what sort of saints' relics you touched, would get you years off your time in purgatory. So this is one real sort of spiritual material reason to go on pilgrimage. Although I have no doubt that many people went on pilgrimage just to have a good time, to escape from their, what they needed to do in their everyday life, as well as with sort of a less self-serving interest of just becoming more thoughtful. So for all of these reasons, pilgrimage was really important in the medieval period. Just as a side note, just like in the modern tourism industry, where you can get little trinkets when you go on vacation, the medieval pilgrimage industry was very much the same. When you went to particular shrines or cathedrals or monasteries, you could pick up pilgrimage badges. And what I've shown here on this slide is an example of perhaps the most famous one. This is the scallop shell that you could receive for going on the Way of St. James, the Camino de Santiago, which ends in Compostela. And on the right-hand side of the image, you can actually see an image of a pilgrim wearing a broad-brimmed pilgrim's hat with a number of these pilgrim badges sort of sewn onto a strap of leather around their hat. So in the same way that when you travel, or maybe you do, maybe you don't, but obviously, like, you know that people often will travel and buy keychains or little pins to stick on their suitcases or their backpacks or what have you. And in the medieval period, people would do this as well. They would buy pilgrim badges, and they would sew them onto their clothing as a way to display all of the arduous sort of pilgrim labors that they had been on. But these pilgrim, so here's another page with a couple more example of pilgrims badges that I think displays the great variety of ways in which we should think about medieval travel. So on the upper left, we have, this is a lead badge. These are mostly lead, by the way. A lead badge that shows the Virgin Mary holding Jesus on her lap, with again, a nice hole in the top to sew it onto a part of your clothing. But we also have many examples of pilgrim badges that are explicit in nature. And so I wanted to include a couple of these because, again, I think that this shows that pilgrimages were spaces of both intense rumination and spirituality, as well as play and joking. It's thought that these phallic and vulvar sort of badges were both apotropaic, that is, that they might ward away danger, but also that they were meant simply just to be like hilarious. And many of them are found in spaces where there had been running water in the medieval period, which were often places where people would throw things as sort of forms of votive offerings. So people were both purchasing these in jest, but also taking them very seriously as holy objects. Okay, I'm going to navigate away from this for a minute. All right. Okay. So, large pilgrimages are a huge part of medieval travel and the way people think about travel. And they still exist today. What I'm showing on the screen here are the many different Chemin de Saint-Jacques, the many different ways to Compostela that a person could take. So ending on the left-hand side of the screen here in Portugal, in Compostela, at the Shrine of St. James, one can think of this as like a series of small rivers floating into a giant river. These are all of the many pilgrimage trails that one can still walk in the modern day if one is so inclined. And in fact, I have walked one of these. If you look in sort of south central France, there's a city called Le Puy-en-Velay. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I walked from Le Puy-en-Velay in southern France to Figeac. It's really just a very small amount of the Chemin de Saint-Jacques, but it took me about 7 days. And on the way, I had lots of really good food. I got to walk through beautiful countryside. I spent a night in a city called Conques that has a beautiful cathedral. These pilgrimage trails are still very much alive and well, and are, in my opinion, if you are able to hike multiple miles in a day, one of the best ways to see France. Okay, just a little bit again, this is like me from 15 years ago, sort of enjoying my time as a single woman before I had any real responsibilities. Okay. But what if those large pilgrimages weren't available to you? What if your job was too demanding? If you didn't have a lot of money? If you were, if you had, if you were tied to place? There were lots of other types of pilgrimages that you could go on as well. Perhaps the most famous of these is narrated in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where a group of somewhere between 29 and 32 pilgrims start in an inn on the south side of London, and over the course of a couple of days are going to make their way to Canterbury. This is a really relatively short pilgrimage, and really very manageable for most people. Medieval people had more vacation days in a year due to the saints' days and the feasts of the Catholic calendar than we do in modern America. So when the opening lines of the Canterbury Tales talk about folk longing to go on pilgrimages, this is really true. In the springtime, people would flock to their local shrines, some going on multi-day journeys in order to get the blessings of the local saint and hopefully to both heal their souls and their bodies from illness. Just another thing here is that the same qualities that we see in the book of Marjorie Kemp, with like people not getting along very well, with fights happening, and with people from various walks of life all mingling in one pilgrimage journey, that happens in the Canterbury Tales too. If you've ever read the poem, which is long and it like includes lots of stories by lots of different people, you know that there's always fights that are about to break out between different members of the Canterbury pilgrimage. Okay, so the Canterbury pilgrimage ends in Canterbury, but there are also other like super miniature pilgrimages that a person can go on. If you've ever been to Chartres or to any number of, especially Episcopalian cathedrals, you may have seen a labyrinth on the floor of the cathedral. Now, this is not universal in medieval cathedrals, but it is an element of many of them. And these labyrinths are meant to be a sort of interior mental pilgrimage that one can go on within a cathedral itself, so that even if one doesn't have the time to go a day or 2 or 3 days away to the local saint shrine, you can go to your nearest cathedral and you can walk this path, meditating as you make your way from the outside to the center rosette and then back out again. And even more interior, we have, from the medieval period, examples of manuscripts meant for recluses, for anchorites, and for monks who are not allowed to even leave their monastic houses or their anchoritic holds. And these are forms of virtual pilgrimage. So what I'm showing you here on the screen right now is a manuscript of a book by a man named Matthew Paris, who's an Englishman. This is his it's the Chronica Majora. It's the big history, and it's a history book. But what he includes in this history book is also a way for medieval monks who were sort of trapped inside their cloister to imagine as if they were on pilgrimage. The images, it's actually 7 images, and I've only included 2 on these slides. But you start in London and you make your way along this itinerary, which is like straight lines up and down. Through, I think you see Calais on here, you see Saint-Richer, you see Beauvais, until you make your way all the way to Jerusalem. And oftentimes these virtual pilgrimages would also include with them like the number of steps that you should walk in your monastic cell if you wanted to actually by foot travel the same distance. So people might be pacing their cells back and forth while reading these books, imagining that they were somewhere else. In addition, maybe one of the most famous travel books of the medieval period is A Complete Fabrication, supposedly written by an English knight named Sir John Mandeville, who is actually an entirely fictional person. This book was probably written by a French monk. The travels of Sir John Mandeville tell the story of a man who started out in England and made his way all the way across Europe, through the Holy Land, through Asia, to Japan, and from there to the lands of the mystical king named Prester John. The book contains all sorts of descriptions of fantastical sorts of people who live at the very limits of the European imagination of what might be something like the strange humans that live in spaces that they have never visited and don't understand. And when I say that this book is incredibly influential, I mean it in a global scale. Christopher Columbus, who is not a very well-read person, was very familiar with the travels of Sir John Mandeville and took them very seriously. And it was partly the lands that Mandeville, this pseudo-Mandeville, had written about that Columbus was looking for when he went on his voyage westward. So Mandeville has a direct line inspiring both one of the sort of most important enslavers and European colonizers and imperialists, as well as the imaginations of countless medieval people and people living after him. Medieval travel in the form of pilgrimage remains actually really inspirational. English heritage, which some of you may be aware of if you've ever traveled in England, boasts a number of walking with the saints pilgrimage tours that you can do on your own. You don't pay to do these, you download the maps and you can walk them yourself. So these include pilgrimages through London to see the medieval and important religious and historical sites there, as well as places in Kent and in Yorkshire. So it remains an inspirational form of travel even today. As Anthony Bell says, and I take Anthony Bell has been one of my sources for this talk, a definition of travel will always fail because whether by design or circumstance, each and every journey is unique. Taking the same route doesn't mean that travelers experience the same journey. Travel is the stories we tell when we come home, not just the actual experience of moving inelegantly, painfully, and grimly across the planet's surface. I personally have taken it as fundamental to my talk today that travel has something to do with going from one place to another for yourself and for your own personal hobby interests, rather than as going from place to place for commercial or business reasons. But if we expand the definition of travel to include other more financial motivations, then travel in the medieval period becomes a much bigger topic. And this could expand to include things like the many Silk Roads that connected Western Europe with Eastern Asia. It could include things like the sociological and anthropological journeys of some of the golden age of Islam's most famous travelers. But for today, I think I will leave it there and try to stop with a couple minutes shy of my 6:15 deadline and open it up to questions.
That was
What I'll do is I'll just leave some of the sources that I think folks who attended this talk might find helpful if they want to, do some reading on their own while we have the Q&A.
This has been wonderful. If you have questions, feel free to either put it in the Q&A box or you can type it into the chat. Either one, it doesn't matter. We will be able to see them. And as you're thinking about your questions, gosh, listening to you, there's a few things that popped into my mind that I was wondering about. You talked about ocean travel and waterway travel being very precarious and dangerous. And one of my first thoughts were, I mean, pirates or people on the water. I'm sure that was probably a common thing back then too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, travel by land and by sea, both very dangerous in the medieval period. Like you never wanted to travel alone. Women in particular never traveled alone. In the land, there were brigands and highwaymen, and on the sea, there were pirates. Although, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in my own research lately is the types of piracy that existed in the medieval period. So you do absolutely, especially in the North Sea, between England, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, northern France, and northern Germany, you absolutely do see ships taking advantage of the fact that Europe was basically at constant war with itself in the medieval period, to commandeer vessels that were on the ocean. And there's this practice known as sea keeping, by which local rulers would actually allow merchants and merchant vessels to engage in sort of defensive acts of piracy too. So if you're in a time of war, say you're England at war with France, the King of England would say, hey, if you're a merchant and you're British or English, excuse me, and you run across a French ship, just take that ship. There's no standing navy in the medieval period. So like, yeah, if you're a merchant and you happen to run across a French ship, just like try to board it and see what you can take. And whatever you can take, I'll give you a share of those goods. And yeah, it doesn't count as piracy, actually. So there are actually licit
Oh.
forms of piracy in the medieval period as well. Yeah, travel's just really dangerous. And I'm not
Mm.
prepared to give like numbers here, but you can kind of get a sense for how dangerous it was by looking at the cost of certain goods in a port where they were shipped from the cost where they end up. It gives you obviously like the cost, there's going to be markup just because there was travel.
Mhm.
But the markup also takes into account risks like the risk of a ship sinking due to
Mm.
storms or piracy. And so you can get a sense for how many ships were lost at sea by what that markup was. And it's something like 1 out of every 20 ships. Like it's not, I
Wow.
mean, I can't remember the exact number, but it's a lot of freaking ships, man.
Yeah,
Like
it's a
a
lot.
lot of ships were sinking. Yeah.
Wow. Well, so
Yeah.
Mary wanted to know, what did they eat? Where did they sleep along the way? Were they
Mm.
inns or, I mean, because there wasn't a Venice everywhere along the way. So when there wasn't a city, what did they do?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, you're traveling with food from time, a lot of the time, pretty simple food. But you're also, for instance, you're not traveling you're not always in a major city, but you're
Hmm.
not necessarily spending the night in the open countryside either. You will end up at an auberge or a rest stop along the way, and the food isn't guaranteed to be good, but you often will have access to some sort of food. That said, there are lots of complaints from medieval pilgrims, excuse me, who write about their journeys, basically being like, when I'm on a ship, the food is awful. It's making me feel sick. I like it's the same thing every day. People talk about even in Venice, kind of getting sick of the local cuisine over time.
Mm.
So there absolutely is the same sense that we have as travelers today. We're like, I don't care how good Italian food is on day 10 of being in Italy. I kind of want a taco, and you get the sense that medieval people felt the same way too. So they're not carrying everything with them in terms of food. But one of the reasons medieval travel was so dangerous is
Hmm.
that a lot of times you are carrying almost all of your money in order to pay for things.
Hmm.
Now, that's not always the case. In the later medieval period, you have these things called bills of exchange that are basically early forms of credit, where you can like take a piece of paper to someone in a city, in a big city, and say, I have money in a bank in Bruges, which means I should be able to take out money here in Milan or whatever. But like generally speaking, when you're traveling with most of the specie that you're going to be spending on that trip. Um,
Wow,
which is
that's
why like
amazing.
travelers are really good
Yeah, that
marks for violence. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Do we know how long Marjorie lived? And then is there physical evidence of her travels in Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. And hi, Amy. Thank you for coming. I know Amy. So I thank you, Amy, for asking a
Oh,
question.
great.
Yeah, so Marjorie probably lived from about 1363 to about 1440. So she wasn't super long lived for a medieval person, but she absolutely had a full life in terms of medieval life expectancy. And okay, so the account that she gives of her travels, um, can we confirm, for instance, that like, is there a logbook that she registered in Rome and like see her signature there?
Hmm.
No, absolutely not. Do we 100% believe that she was a real person? Yes, there is archival evidence of her from Bishop's Lynn in the medieval period. She was the daughter of the town's mayor. He had been mayor 5 times. She was probably one of the wealthiest people in Bishop's Lynn. And we also
Hmm.
have records of her supporting the guild, the shipping guild, I believe it was in Bishop's
Hmm.
Lynn. So we know that she was a real historical person. And based on other pilgrims' accounts from that period, and we have no reason to doubt that she went on the travels that she did. Um, they're
Oh, that's
the
great.
sorts of the sorts of trips that she took were very similar to the sorts of trips that other pilgrims would have taken. I mean, I think we can absolutely question the veracity of some of the things that she talks about. But I'm inclined to believe that she went on those trips.
Were there any other accountings about her? Like, did anybody else write about her in any sort of journals or books?
No, and okay, the answer is no. And that gets into issues of sort of medieval manuscript culture and where her book survives that
Mhm.
I'm happy to talk about at length, but it doesn't specifically get to the topic of medieval travel. But basically,
Yep.
the reason that she recorded her life story at all is that she was we think she was probably trying to get a sainthood. And so she told her life story to
Oh.
a priest in order to submit her life story to basically the process to become a saint. And it only circulates there's one manuscript that exists and it circulates in a really specific medieval manuscript context. And we know that the monks who had her manuscript were like big fanboys of her. In fact, they engaged in the same sorts of wailing and screaming that she did in sort of mimicry of her. Um, but as far as I know, we don't have documents that
Funny.
like show like we don't have like other books that talk about her.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Brittany was wondering, what did luggage look like? She says, I can't imagine medieval pilgrims worrying about what will fit in a carry-on. I totally
Yeah,
agree.
I mean, that's a great question. Pilgrims with any means whatsoever would have pack animals and would have uh they would have carts that would go with them. So like, okay, here's where I need to say that like there's not one type of medieval pilgrim, right? Like there are really
Mm,
wealthy ones like kings and queens who are traveling with entire retinues of servants and ways to carry all of the stuff that they bring with them. For some, there's a record of one medieval prince who like goes on pilgrimage with like a bunch of chess sets and like basically all of his stuff to keep him occupied on the trip. Um,
mm,
but like your typical pilgrim who didn't have a lot might have something like a mule or a donkey or a horse. They would have the traditional sort of pilgrim staff. They might have like a bindle staff. So like, there's some of their belongings tied in a little baggie around the staff. But
mhm,
it really depends on the level of means that you have. Um,
mm.
yeah.
That's great. I loved it when you talked about the different charms in your presentation, because I know a lot of travelers to this day still carry and purchase charms wherever they go. I mean, Pandora charms or even a charm in terms of a Christmas ornament, or some of our travelers collect spoons from every place that they've been. So it's pretty fun to hear that that practice dates so far back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really cool. These are things that so like if you don't mind spending a little bit of money, you can purchase these pilgrim badges. They pop up for sale from time to time on various like collectors sites, eBay, etc. And not all of them are fake. Like
Mm,
there's a market for these as antiquities, and they're not as like they're more expensive, for instance, than like buying ancient coins, for instance. Like there's a lot of coins in circulation, but you can absolutely purchase medieval pilgrim badges. And for instance, my PhD advisor has a small collection. They're definitely available.
wow.
Yeah.
Huh, that's
I
really
mean,
great.
they were just so popular, like people bought them everywhere that they went. And you
Yeah.
pay a certain amount of money to get this little badge, and it confers a certain amount of holiness on you. And it's also a token
Hmm.
of your visit. There's examples from medieval poetry. One of my favorite poems is called Piers Plowman. And there's this moment in the text where a pilgrim comes up and his clothes are like literally all covered with these pilgrim badges. And some of the characters in the poem are like, "Oh, you must be so holy because you look at all these badges you're wearing." And someone else is like, "No, you could just buy those badges and not have any holiness whatsoever." So there's even as the badges were a really important part of medieval travel, they were also
Yeah.
something that people were kind of suspicious of. Like I could go online
Mm,
and I could buy a little trinket that said, I don't know, that said Rio de Janeiro on it, but it doesn't
yeah.
mean that I've been to Rio de Janeiro, right? And medieval people were also in that business of fraud and pretending to have been places that they hadn't been.
Oh, well, yeah, well, I guess that's human nature in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think that some of these practices are very medieval. I don't know that a
Mm.
ton of people today still travel with like the depth of intensity of spirituality and think of travel as like a way to like buy a better way into heaven. Certainly that still happens because we're not a totally secular world, right? But a lot of the other stuff about medieval travel is just very human. It's the human experience.
Well, it can be spiritual in the way of just wanting to better oneself. And
Sure.
definitely traveling today does fill that niche to learn about yourself, to learn about other cultures and to grow as a person. And that's a big part of travel today.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I would argue that that's like a different sort of growing, right? Like that's like a
Hmm.
sort of like humanitarian, like it's like a yeah, like a humanist way of thinking about the purpose of travel. Like I want to go to this culture to like explore the culture for what the culture has to offer. I can virtually guarantee you that when Marjorie Kemp is going to Jerusalem, she's not thinking at all about like, oh, this is a city that's both Jewish and Muslim and Christian at this time in history, and like, how can I better understand Jewish people and Muslims? Like, she's not thinking about that at all.
Right.
She's thinking about like, how can I get closer to an experience of Christ?
Huh. That's really interesting. This is great.
Mhm.
Oh, Brittany wanted to know, how did people prepare for inclement weather?
Yeah. Oh my God, that's such a good question, Brittany. Come and talk to me in like 2 or 3 years because I'm currently in a working group that's looking at the way medieval people predicted the weather.
Wow.
Yeah, so there, by the late medieval period, you do have a handful of people who are trying to and are keeping weather journals and are trying to figure out like how is today's weather predictive of tomorrow's. But atmospheric science is very complicated, and we have not really solved that problem in 2025.
Hmm.
It definitely hadn't solved it in the medieval period. So there are different ways of thinking about like what the weather is going to be like in the future. There's like astrology is a way of trying to predict what the future weather patterns
Mm.
are going to be. Different planets are thought to have different influences on the sphere of the earth and the sort of watery and airy like spheres that went around it. So like astrological prediction is one way. But there's also a lot of craft knowledge that goes into predicting what the weather is going to be that doesn't get written down in manuscripts. And so we have to kind of um, look in strange places to find out what that craft knowledge would have been. Most medieval people were farmers and they had a pretty good understanding of weather patterns in their area, what clouds
Mm.
on one day predicted what sort of weather the next. Whether a year was supposed to be like dry or wet. It doesn't
Hmm.
mean that they were doing really great scientifically accurate predictions, but there are like sort of lament poetry from the medieval period that talks about like people are so sinful today that they can't even look at the clouds and determine what the weather's going to be tomorrow anymore, which
Huh.
suggests that they used to be able to at one point in time, and that there was a desire to be able to predict.
Oh, wow. That's
Um,
great.
but but like I think the upshot of this is that I think medieval travel was really uncomfortable. Like I think a lot of times you were just, kind of having to prepare for whatever, and if you weren't prepared, then you weren't prepared.
Yeah,
Um,
I would 100% agree with that. Very much uncomfortable.
but speaking as someone who on that pilgrimage trip that I took 15 years ago, was not prepared with like wet weather clothing and who got horrible raw spots and then blisters in my shoulders from carrying a
Oh,
backpack in the
yeah,
rain. Like
yeah.
I'm not a medieval person, and I also did a really bad job of preparing for the weather. So we're really good at also not preparing for the weather, or
Oh, it's
maybe it's
great.
just
Well, we are now getting to the end of the chat. So I just wanted to thank you very much for joining us today. And I wanted to mention really quick, because as you're talking about pilgrimages, just let folks know in 2026, we're offering a Basque country walking tour. So it's not necessarily a pilgrimage, but it is a walking tour through the Basque country. So you might want to keep in mind of that one in 2026. And Mary says that this was wonderful and very interesting, and thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And this talk was recorded, and we will add it to our Travel Talks library of conversations. So if you want to share it with a friend, you'll get an email in your inbox with the link to it and be able to share it with anyone you want. Thank you very much for joining us today. This has been lovely.
All right, and thanks. And my invitation to email me and get in touch stands. So if anybody wants to reach out, please do.
All right.
All
Okay.
right,
Have a great night, everyone.
bye.